Captain Sarah Mitchell gripped the control stick of her A-10 Thunderbolt II as the desert sun blazed overhead. The radio crackled with urgent messages from ground forces pinned down in a valley surrounded by enemy positions. She had been flying combat missions for 3 years, but nothing had prepared her for what she was about to face. The morning had started like any other at the forward operating base in Afghanistan. Sarah completed her pre-flight checks while her crew chief ran through the weapon systems one final time. Her A-10, nicknamed Desert Angel by the ground troops, carried a full load of 30mm ammunition and Maverick missiles. The aircraft was built for close air support, designed to fly low and engage enemy targets that threatened friendly forces. As she taxied to the runway, Sarah received her mission briefing through her headset. A platoon of American soldiers had become trapped during a routine patrol. Intelligence reports indicated they were facing overwhelming odds. Nearly 300 enemy fighters had surrounded their position in a narrow canyon. The soldiers had taken cover behind rocky outcroppings, but their ammunition was running low and casualties were mounting. The Flight Operations Center had originally planned to send a full squadron of aircraft to provide support. However, mechanical problems and other urgent missions had left most planes grounded. Sarah found herself as the only available pilot with a combat-ready aircraft. The mission commander's voice was tense as he explained the situation. Time was critical. The trapped soldiers had perhaps an hour before their position would be completely overrun. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders as she accelerated down the runway. Behind her, she left a base full of worried faces watching her single aircraft disappear into the vast Afghan sky. The flight to the target area would take 25 minutes and every second counted. She pushed her A-10 to maximum speed while running through attack scenarios in her mind. During flight training, instructors had always emphasized the importance of following proper procedures and waiting for adequate support. The standard protocol for such a heavily defended target would require multiple aircraft, extensive reconnaissance, and careful coordination with ground forces. But Sarah knew the soldiers below didn't have time for standard protocols. As she approached the target coordinates, Sarah could see smoke rising from the canyon where the firefight raged. Her radio filled with desperate calls from the ground team leader, describing their deteriorating situation. Enemy fire was intensifying, and they had already lost several men. The team's medic was treating wounded soldiers while trying to stay behind cover. Sarah circled high above the canyon, studying the terrain through her targeting systems. The enemy positions were well concealed among the rocks and caves that dotted the canyon walls. Traditional bombing runs would be difficult due to the proximity of friendly forces to enemy positions. She would need to fly dangerously low to ensure accuracy and avoid hitting the American soldiers. The magnitude of what she faced became clear as she completed her reconnaissance pass. Nearly 300 enemy fighters had established defensive positions throughout the canyon. They had heavy machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and mortars positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. The trapped American platoon, consisting of just 32 soldiers, was completely surrounded in a small clearing at the canyon's center. Sarah's training told her to request additional support and establish a proper attack plan. But the radio chatter from below painted a picture of men fighting for their lives with dwindling resources. She made a decision that would define her military career and potentially save the lives of 32 American soldiers. She would engage the enemy positions alone, regardless of the overwhelming odds and the protocols that advised against such action. The radio erupted with voices from the command center as Sarah descended toward the canyon. Major Henderson, the flight operations commander, was ordering her to maintain altitude and wait for backup aircraft that were still hours away from being mission-ready. His voice carried the authority of years of military experience and the weight of operational doctrine. Desert Angel, this is Flight Ops. You are ordered to establish a holding pattern at 15,000 feet and await additional support. Do not engage enemy positions without proper backup, Henderson commanded through the static-filled radio transmission. Sarah's jaw tightened as she listened to the order. Below her, she could hear the ground team leader's increasingly desperate calls for immediate air support. Sergeant Rodriguez was coordinating the defense of his trapped platoon, while enemy fire intensified around their position. His voice cracked with exhaustion and urgency as he reported that they were down to their last magazines of ammunition. Flight Ops, this is Desert Angel. Ground forces are in immediate danger and cannot wait for additional support. I'm beginning my attack run, Sarah responded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The radio fell silent for a moment before Henderson's voice returned, sharper and more insistent. Negative, Desert Angel. You are outnumbered nearly 10 to 1. Mission protocol requires minimum 2 aircraft support for targets of this size. Return to holding pattern immediately. Sarah understood the reasoning behind the order. Military protocols existed to protect pilots and ensure mission success through overwhelming force and careful planning. Engaging such a large enemy force with a single aircraft violated every tactical manual ever written. The A-10 was powerful, but it was not invincible, and the enemy below had enough firepower to bring down her aircraft if she made a mistake. But as she circled above the canyon, Sarah could see muzzle flashes from hundreds of enemy weapons converging on the small area where the American soldiers had taken cover. Smoke grenades marked their perimeter, but the white smoke was dissipating quickly in the desert wind. Time was running out, and she was the only hope these soldiers had. Sir, with respect, those men don't have time for backup. I'm going in, Sarah announced as she pushed her control stick forward and began her descent toward the enemy positions. The radio exploded with activity as Henderson attempted to countermand her decision. Other voices joined the conversation. The base commander, intelligence officers, and even the air traffic controller who was tracking her aircraft's movement toward the target area. Everyone was telling her to abort the mission and follow orders. Sarah switched off her primary radio channel and tuned to the frequency used by the ground forces. She needed to coordinate directly with the soldiers below to avoid hitting friendly positions during her attack runs. The voices from command faded into background noise as she focused on the tactical situation developing beneath her aircraft. Sergeant Rodriguez's voice came through clearly on the ground frequency. Any aircraft in the area, this is Bravo Company. We are taking heavy casualties and need immediate close air support. Our position is marked with orange smoke. Bravo Company, this is Desert Angel. I see your orange smoke and am beginning attack runs on enemy positions. Keep your heads down and mark your perimeter clearly. Sarah responded as she lined up her first target. Her targeting systems locked onto a cluster of enemy fighters positioned on a rocky ledge overlooking the trapped Americans. The enemy had chosen their position well. They had clear lines of fire into the canyon while remaining partially concealed behind natural rock formations. Sarah knew that eliminating this position would relieve some of the pressure on the soldiers below. As she descended to attack altitude, Sarah could see tracer rounds from enemy weapons creating deadly streams of light across the canyon floor. The American soldiers were returning fire when possible, but they were clearly outgunned and running low on ammunition. Several soldiers appeared to be wounded, and their defensive perimeter was shrinking under the relentless enemy assault. Sarah armed her 30mm cannon and prepared for her first attack run. The Gyu-8 Avenger cannon was the A-10's primary weapon, capable of firing depleted uranium rounds at an incredible rate. Each round could penetrate armor and destroy fortified positions, making it ideal for the precision strikes she needed to execute. The command frequency continued to buzz with orders for her to abort the mission, but Sarah had made her decision. She would face whatever consequences came from disobeying direct orders, but she would not abandon the soldiers fighting for their lives below. As she began her attack dive, Sarah whispered a prayer and prepared to take on nearly 300 enemy fighters with nothing but her skill, her aircraft, and an unwavering determination to bring her fellow Americans home alive. Sarah's A-10 screamed down through the thin mountain air as she lined up her first target. The enemy position on the rocky ledge came into sharp focus through her heads-up display. She could see individual fighters scrambling to reposition their heavy machine gun as they realized an aircraft was diving toward them. The distinctive roar of the A-10's twin engines echoed off the canyon walls, announcing her arrival to every fighter in the valley. At 800 feet above the target, Sarah squeezed the trigger. The Gyu-8 cannon erupted with a thunderous buzz that drowned out all other sounds. 30mm rounds streaked toward the enemy position at incredible velocity, each projectile capable of destroying light vehicles and fortifications. The rocky ledge exploded in a shower of dust and debris as the depleted uranium rounds found their mark. The effect was immediate and devastating. The enemy machine gun position disappeared in a cloud of smoke and pulverized rock. Sarah pulled hard on the control stick, banking sharply to the right as she climbed away from the target area. Behind her, secondary explosions indicated that her rounds had detonated ammunition stored at the enemy position. Direct hit on the north ledge. That's beautiful shooting, Desert Angel. Sergeant Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio, filled with renewed hope. The pressure on the eastern side of the American perimeter had decreased significantly, with the elimination of the overlooking position. But Sarah's relief was short-lived. As she climbed away from her first target, the sky around her aircraft filled with tracer rounds and rocket-propelled grenades. The enemy fighters had quickly identified the threat she posed and were directing concentrated anti-aircraft fire toward her position. Red and green tracers streaked past her cockpit as she maneuvered to avoid the incoming fire. A rocket-propelled grenade exploded just 50 feet from her left wing, close enough that she could feel the shockwave through the aircraft's frame. The A-10 was built to withstand battle damage, but no aircraft could survive a direct hit from the volume of fire being directed at her. Sarah pushed the throttles forward and climbed rapidly while scanning for her next target. From her higher altitude, she could see the full scope of the enemy deployment. Machine gun nests were positioned throughout the canyon, creating interlocking fields of fire that kept the American soldiers pinned down. Mortar teams were set up in concealed positions, lobbing explosive rounds into the area where the Americans had taken cover. Most concerning were the anti-aircraft weapons that were now tracking her movement across the sky. Sarah identified her next priority target, a mortar position that was causing significant casualties among the trapped soldiers. The enemy had positioned the mortars behind a large boulder that provided protection from ground-level return fire, but left them exposed to air attack. She rolled her aircraft into a steep dive, once again heading directly into the concentrated enemy fire. This time, the enemy was ready for her. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire as soon as she began her descent, filling the air with a deadly curtain of bullets and explosive rounds. Sarah jinked left and right, using every evasive maneuver she had learned during combat training. The A-10's rugged design allowed her to maintain accuracy, even while conducting violent evasive actions. At 600 feet, Sarah engaged the mortar position with another burst from her cannon. The 30mm rounds tore through the enemy fighters and destroyed their equipment in a matter of seconds. But as she pulled up from the attack run, she felt her aircraft shudder as enemy rounds found their mark. Warning lights illuminated her instrument panel, indicating damage to hydraulic systems. "Desert Angel, you're trailing smoke from your left engine," Rodriguez called out from below. The sergeant and his men could see the black smoke streaming from Sarah's aircraft as she climbed away from the target area. Sarah quickly scanned her instruments and assessed the damage. The left engine was running rough but still producing power. Hydraulic pressure was dropping, which would make the aircraft more difficult to control. But she still had enough systems operational to continue the fight. The A-10 had been designed to absorb battle damage and keep flying, a capability that was now being tested under the most extreme conditions. Despite the damage to her aircraft, Sarah's attack runs were having a significant impact on the battle below. The elimination of two key enemy positions had reduced the pressure on the American soldiers and given them room to maneuver. Several of the wounded had been moved to more secure positions, and the platoon was beginning to organize a more effective defense. But nearly 300 enemy fighters remained in the canyon, and they were adapting their tactics to counter the air threat. Anti-aircraft teams were repositioning to create a more effective defensive umbrella, while other fighters continued to pressure the American ground forces. Sarah realized that she would need to modify her approach if she hoped to continue providing effective support while keeping her damaged aircraft in the fight. As she climbed to assess her options, Sarah could hear renewed firing from the canyon below. The enemy was pressing their advantage, knowing that the lone aircraft above them was damaged and would eventually be forced to withdraw. Time was still working against the trapped soldiers, and Sarah knew that her next few attack runs would be critical in determining the outcome of the battle. With her left engine sputtering and hydraulic fluid streaming from damaged lines, Sarah faced a critical decision. Standard operating procedures dictated that aircraft with significant battle damage should immediately return to base for emergency landing. The warning lights on her instrument panel painted the cockpit in an ominous red glow, and the control stick required increasing force to maintain proper flight attitude. But below her, the American soldiers were still fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. During her brief climb to assess aircraft damage, Sarah could see that the enemy had used the temporary respite to reorganize their positions. Fresh fighters were moving to replace those eliminated in her previous attacks, and the volume of fire directed at the trapped Americans was increasing once again. Desert Angel, this is Flight Ops. Your aircraft is showing significant damage on our monitoring systems. You are ordered to return to base immediately for emergency landing procedures. Major Henderson's voice cut through the tactical frequency with unmistakable authority. Sarah ignored the transmission and switched back to the ground forces frequency. Bravo Company, this is Desert Angel. What's your current status down there? Sergeant Rodriguez's voice came back strained with exhaustion and urgency. Desert Angel, we've got wounded who need immediate evacuation, but we can't move from this position. Enemy is massing for what looks like a final assault on our perimeter. We count at least 200 hostiles still active in the canyon. The situation on the ground was deteriorating rapidly, despite Sarah's initial success. The enemy commanders had recognized that the air threat was limited to a single damaged aircraft and were concentrating their forces for an overwhelming ground assault. Machine gun teams were advancing to closer positions while mortar crews prepared to bracket the American defensive position with concentrated fire. Sarah made a quick calculation of her remaining weapons and fuel. She had expended approximately 30% of her 30mm ammunition during the first 2 attack runs, leaving her with enough rounds for several more engagements. Her Maverick missiles remained untouched, but using them in close proximity to friendly forces would require extreme precision. Most critically, her fuel situation was becoming a concern due to the increased consumption of her damaged left engine. Bravo Company, I'm staying on station. Mark your perimeter with whatever signaling devices you have available. I'm going to work the enemy position systematically, Sarah announced as she began planning her next series of attacks. The enemy had learned from her previous tactics and had dispersed their anti-aircraft weapons throughout the canyon. Instead of concentrating all their firepower in one area, they had created multiple smaller positions that could provide mutual support, while making it difficult for Sarah to eliminate them all in single attack runs. This new defensive arrangement would require her to make more passes through their fire zone, increasing her exposure to enemy weapons. Sarah identified a cluster of enemy fighters who were using a series of connected caves as fighting positions. These natural fortifications provided excellent protection from ground-level assault, but had limited overhead cover. The cave network was positioned on the western wall of the canyon and commanded a clear view of the American defensive perimeter. As she rolled into her attack dive, the sky once again filled with anti-aircraft fire. This time the enemy gunners had better anticipated her flight path, and the volume of fire was even more intense than before. Tracer rounds created a deadly web of light around her aircraft as she descended toward the target. Sarah felt her A-10 shudder repeatedly as enemy rounds struck the armored hull. At 700 feet she opened fire with her cannon, walking the 30mm rounds across the cave entrances. The depleted uranium projectiles penetrated deep into the rock formations, collapsing several cave mouths and eliminating the fighters positioned inside. But as she pulled up from the attack run, Sarah felt her aircraft respond sluggishly to her control inputs. A warning tone sounded in her headset, indicating that her right engine was now also showing signs of damage. Engine temperature was climbing rapidly, and oil pressure was beginning to fluctuate. Sarah realized that her aircraft was approaching the limits of its operational capability, but the battle below was reaching its critical phase. Beautiful work, Desert Angel. You knocked out their western positions, Rodriguez called out with obvious relief. But they're massing for assault from the north. Looks like 50 to 60 fighters moving to assault positions. Sarah could see the enemy movement from her elevated position. The remaining fighters were abandoning their defensive positions and preparing for a coordinated ground assault on the American perimeter. If they succeeded in overrunning the soldiers' position, no amount of air support would be able to help. This was the moment that would determine the outcome of the entire engagement. Despite her aircraft's deteriorating condition, Sarah knew she had to stop the enemy assault before it could reach the American defensive line. She armed her Maverick missiles and began searching for the most effective target among the advancing enemy forces. The precision-guided weapons would give her the capability to strike with devastating effect, but she would have to fly dangerously close to friendly positions to ensure accuracy. As she maneuvered for her next attack, Sarah could feel her damaged aircraft fighting against her every control input. The A-10 was living up to its reputation as a survivable aircraft, but even its legendary toughness had limits. She knew that each subsequent attack run increased the likelihood of catastrophic failure, but the soldiers below were depending on her to hold the line until help could arrive. The enemy assault began with a coordinated mortar barrage that shook the canyon walls and sent clouds of dust and debris raining down on the American positions. Sarah watched from above as nearly 60 enemy fighters advanced across the rocky terrain, using natural cover to mask their approach. They moved with the precision of experienced combatants, coordinating their assault to hit the weakest points of the American defensive perimeter simultaneously. Sergeant Rodriguez and his men opened fire with their remaining ammunition, but their defensive fire was sporadic and increasingly ineffective. Several soldiers were down to their last magazines, and the wounded were unable to contribute to the fight. The platoon's medic was treating 3 critically wounded soldiers behind a large boulder, while trying to stay below the trajectory of incoming rounds. Desert Angel.
They're breaking through our north perimeter.
We need immediate support on the advancing infantry. Rodriguez's voice carried a note of desperation as enemy fighters, close to within 50 meters of his position. Sarah armed her first Maverick missile and locked onto the largest concentration of advancing enemy forces. The precision-guided weapon would be devastating against infantry in the open, but the proximity to friendly forces made the shot extremely dangerous. Any miscalculation could result in American casualties from her own ordnance. Her targeting computer confirmed lock-on as she lined up the shot. The enemy fighters were advancing in a loose formation across a rocky slope that provided little cover from air attack. Sarah knew this was her best opportunity to break the assault before it could reach the American defensive line. Bravo Company, danger close missile incoming on the northern slope. All personnel take cover immediately, Sarah announced as she squeezed the trigger. The Maverick missile ignited and streaked away from her aircraft, leaving a thin trail of white smoke as it guided toward the target. The precision weapon struck the center of the advancing enemy formation and exploded with tremendous force. The blast wave rolled across the slope, eliminating more than 20 enemy fighters and scattering the survivors who sought cover among the rocks. But Sarah's success came at a cost. As she pulled up from the missile run, her right engine finally succumbed to the accumulated battle damage. The turbine seized with a grinding metallic screech, and the engine fire warning light illuminated on her instrument panel. Emergency procedures demanded immediate engine shutdown to prevent catastrophic fire or explosion. Flying on a single engine dramatically reduced her aircraft's performance and maneuverability. The A-10 could operate on one engine, but climbing capability was severely limited and turning radius increased significantly. More critically, her fuel consumption would increase as the remaining engine worked harder to maintain flight. Despite the crippling damage to her aircraft, Sarah's missile strike had broken the momentum of the enemy assault. The surviving fighters had taken cover and were no longer advancing toward the American positions. However, she could see that they were regrouping for another attempt, and this time they would be more cautious about exposing themselves to air attack. Outstanding hit, Desert Angel. You stopped their assault cold, Rodriguez reported with obvious relief. But we're still pinned down and running low on ammunition. How much longer can you stay on station? Sarah quickly calculated her remaining fuel and weapons. With one engine shut down, her endurance was reduced to perhaps 20 more minutes of combat operations. She had one Maverick missile remaining, and approximately 60% of her cannon ammunition. Most importantly, she could see that additional enemy reinforcements were moving into the canyon from the eastern approaches. The radio crackled with transmissions from the command center as Major Henderson attempted to order her immediate return to base. Flight operations had been monitoring her aircraft systems remotely and were aware of her engine failure. Standard emergency procedures required immediate landing at the nearest suitable airfield. Desert Angel, this is Flight Ops. You are flying on a single engine with critical system failures. You will comply with emergency landing procedures immediately. That is a direct order. Henderson's voice carried the full weight of military authority. Sarah understood the risks she was taking by continuing the mission with a severely damaged aircraft. Engine failure during low-level operations could result in catastrophic loss of the aircraft and pilot. But she also understood that abandoning the mission would likely result in the death or capture of 32 American soldiers who had no other source of immediate Support enemy fighters were already beginning to probe the American perimeter again, testing for weak points they could exploit. The brief respite provided by her missile strike was ending, and the enemy was preparing for another assault. This time they would likely succeed unless she could find a way to disrupt their attack. Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her military career and potentially cost her life. She would continue flying combat missions until her aircraft could no longer remain airborne, or until relief forces arrived to assist the trapped soldiers. The odds were heavily stacked against her, but she refused to abandon her fellow Americans. "Flight Ops, I understand your orders, but these soldiers need immediate support. I'm staying on station until the situation is resolved," Sarah announced as she turned her crippled aircraft toward the regrouping enemy forces. The response from command was immediate and uncompromising, but Sarah had already switched to the ground forces frequency and was coordinating her next attack with Sergeant Rodriguez. She could see enemy fighters moving into position for another assault, and time was running out for both her aircraft and the soldiers on the ground. With her aircraft barely controllable on a single engine, Sarah faced the most challenging phase of the engagement. The enemy had adapted their tactics once again, spreading their forces across multiple positions to minimize the effectiveness of her airstrikes. Nearly 150 fighters remained active in the canyon, and they were coordinating a systematic assault designed to overwhelm the American defensive position through sheer numbers. The fuel gauge showed critical levels as Sarah maneuvered her damaged A-10 for what might be her final attack runs. Every minute of continued flight brought her closer to flameout, which would force an emergency landing in hostile territory. But below her, the American soldiers were making their own final stand against impossible odds. Sergeant Rodriguez had consolidated his remaining effective fighters into a tight defensive circle around the wounded. Ammunition was so low that soldiers were limited to single, carefully aimed shots. The platoon's radio operator was calling for emergency ammunition resupply, but no helicopters could reach their position while the canyon remained under enemy control. "Desert Angel, we've got enemy forces moving in from 3 directions. Estimate 150 hostiles converging on our position. We can hold maybe 10 more minutes before they overrun us." Rodriguez reported with the calm professionalism of a seasoned combat leader facing inevitable defeat. Sarah surveyed the tactical situation from her diminishing altitude. Her single engine was struggling to maintain power, forcing her to fly lower and slower than optimal for combat operations. This reduced performance made her more vulnerable to enemy fire, while limiting her tactical options. Yet she could see opportunities to disrupt the enemy assault. If she was willing to take extreme risks, the largest concentration of enemy fighters was advancing through a narrow defile on the eastern side of the canyon. The terrain channeled their movement into a confined area where a precise strike could eliminate multiple targets simultaneously. However, reaching the attack position would require flying directly through the heaviest concentration of anti-aircraft fire. Sarah armed her final Maverick missile and began her approach to the target area. Enemy gunners had positioned themselves throughout the canyon specifically to counter her attacks, creating overlapping fields of fire that made evasive maneuvering nearly impossible. As she descended toward attack altitude, the sky around her aircraft erupted with tracer rounds and explosive projectiles. A rocket-propelled grenade exploded directly beneath her aircraft, close enough that she could see the flash through her cockpit floor. The blast wave lifted her A-10 violently upward while fragments peppered the armored hull. Warning lights flickered across her instrument panel as additional systems sustained damage. But the aircraft remained controllable. At 400 feet above the target, Sarah launched her final Maverick missile into the concentrated enemy formation. The precision weapon guided flawlessly to its target and detonated with devastating effect among the advancing fighters. The explosion echoed off the canyon walls as the missile eliminated more than 30 enemy combatants and scattered the survivors. But as Sarah pulled up from the attack run, her aircraft was hit by concentrated fire from multiple anti-aircraft positions. She felt the control stick go slack in her hands as hydraulic lines were severed, and the A-10 began an uncontrolled descent toward the canyon floor. Emergency systems activated automatically, but Sarah knew her aircraft was approaching the limits of survivability. Fighting against failing flight controls, Sarah managed to level her aircraft just 50 feet above the rocky terrain. The A-10 was flying on emergency power and backup systems, but it was still airborne and her cannon remained operational. She had perhaps 1 or 2 attack runs remaining before catastrophic system failure would force her to attempt an emergency landing. Incredible shot, Desert Angel. You broke their main assault, Rodriguez called out with amazement. But you're flying awfully low. Are you hit? Sarah's aircraft was indeed critically damaged, but she could see that her attacks had fundamentally changed the tactical situation. The enemy assault had been disrupted, and many of the surviving fighters were beginning to withdraw from their advanced positions. The momentum of the battle was finally shifting in favor of the trapped Americans. However, approximately 100 enemy fighters remained in the canyon, and they were still capable of overwhelming the American position if they could organize another coordinated assault. Sarah realized that she needed to use her remaining ammunition to maximum effect, targeting the enemy leadership and communication centers that were coordinating the assault. Flying at extremely low altitude to avoid the worst of the anti-aircraft fire, Sarah identified what appeared to be a command post positioned on a central ridge overlooking the entire battlefield. Enemy commanders were directing fighter movements from this elevated position, and eliminating them could leave the remaining forces without effective coordination. Sarah lined up her final attack run with her 30mm cannon, knowing that this would likely be her last opportunity to influence the outcome of the battle. Her fuel was nearly exhausted, her aircraft was barely controllable, and enemy fire was intensifying as the remaining fighters recognized that her aircraft was critically damaged. As she approached the target, Sarah could see individual enemy fighters abandoning their positions and beginning to withdraw from the canyon. Her sustained attacks had inflicted such heavy casualties that the surviving forces were losing the will to continue the assault. The tide of battle was turning, but she needed to ensure that the enemy withdrawal became a complete retreat. Sarah's final cannon burst silenced the enemy command post in a shower of rock and debris. The 30mm rounds tore through the position with devastating precision, eliminating the remaining enemy leadership and their communications equipment. Without central coordination, the assault on the American position collapsed as individual fighters began, retreating independently toward the canyon exits. Her aircraft's fuel warning alarm sounded continuously as Sarah pulled up from her final attack run. The single remaining engine was running rough and showing signs of imminent failure. Below her, the canyon that had been filled with nearly 300 enemy fighters was now largely empty, except for the American soldiers who were beginning to emerge from their defensive positions. Desert Angel, this is Bravo Company. Enemy forces are in full retreat. You did it. All hostiles are withdrawing from the canyon. Sergeant Rodriguez's voice carried pure elation as he reported the dramatic change in their tactical situation. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her as she realized the mission had succeeded. The 32 trapped American soldiers were safe, and the enemy force had been decisively defeated. But her own situation remained critical, as her aircraft struggled to maintain altitude on failing systems and minimal fuel. Bravo Company, this is Desert Angel. Glad I could help. I'm going to try to make it back to base, but my aircraft is in bad shape. Request immediate medical evacuation for your wounded. Sarah responded as she turned her crippled A-10 toward the distant airbase. The flight back to base became a testament to both Sarah's piloting skills and the A-10's legendary durability. Multiple systems continued to fail during the 20-minute flight, but the aircraft's redundant design allowed it to keep flying despite catastrophic damage. Sarah nursed every ounce of performance from her dying engine, while monitoring fuel levels that continued dropping toward empty. Emergency vehicles were positioned along the runway as Sarah approached for landing. Her aircraft was trailing smoke from multiple sources, and ground observers could see extensive battle damage across the airframe. The landing gear extended properly despite hydraulic system failures, but the approach required careful energy management with limited engine power available. Sarah touched down hard but safely, bringing her battle-scarred A-10 to a stop just short of the runway's end. As she shut down the remaining engine, she could hear sirens approaching as fire and rescue crews surrounded her aircraft. The post-flight inspection would later reveal that her A-10 had sustained more than 200 separate battle damage hits while remaining flyable. The immediate aftermath of Sarah's mission was complex and controversial. Major Henderson was waiting when she climbed out of her cockpit, his expression a mixture of relief at her safe return and anger at her insubordination. The formal debrief would address her direct violation of orders and failure to follow established protocols during combat operations. Captain Mitchell, you disobeyed direct orders and violated every tactical doctrine in the manual. There will be a formal investigation into your conduct during this mission, Henderson announced as Sarah removed her helmet and flight gear. But even as the major spoke, radio reports were coming in from the rescue helicopters that had reached the trapped soldiers. All 32 Americans were alive, with only minor casualties despite facing overwhelming odds for several hours. The enemy force had suffered catastrophic losses, with intelligence estimates suggesting that more than 200 fighters had been eliminated during the engagement. News of Sarah's single-handed victory against impossible odds spread quickly through military channels and eventually reached the media. The story of a female pilot who ignored orders to save trapped soldiers captured public imagination and sparked debates about military protocol versus individual initiative in combat situations. The formal investigation into Sarah's conduct lasted several weeks and included testimony from all surviving members of Bravo Company. Sergeant Rodriguez and his soldiers provided detailed accounts of how Sarah's air support had saved their lives when no other help was available. Their testimony emphasized that standard protocols would have resulted in their deaths or capture. The investigation's findings were unprecedented in military history. While Sarah had clearly violated direct orders and established procedures, her actions had achieved complete mission success with minimal friendly casualties. The enemy force had been decisively defeated by a single pilot in a damaged aircraft, proving that sometimes individual courage and initiative could overcome overwhelming odds. The final report recommended that Sarah receive a formal reprimand for disobeying orders, but also recommended her for the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat. The contradiction reflected the complex nature of her actions, technically insubordinate but ultimately successful and heroic. Sarah's story became a case study in military academies worldwide, examining the tension between following orders and taking initiative in combat situations. Her decision to engage nearly 300 enemy fighters alone had violated every tactical manual but had saved the lives of 32 American soldiers who had no other hope of rescue. The A-10 Desert Angel was eventually repaired and returned to service, bearing small mission markers commemorating Sarah's unprecedented victory. But Sarah herself requested transfer to a training command, where she could share her combat experience with the next generation of pilots while staying close to her family. Her single-handed victory against impossible odds had proven that sometimes one person, making the right decision at the right moment, could change the course of history.